Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Are superheroes fascist? What does Alan Moore have to say about this question? He did an interview in 2022 for Screen Rant that has been discussed in a lot of places where he talked quite a lot about this idea that there's something fascist about superheroes. And while this is perhaps one of the biggest names to talk about it, Alan Moore, for those who don't know, is the author of comic books, graphic novels such as V for Vendetta and The Watchmen. He did a lot of some of people's absolute favorite of the Batman comics runs in recent years. He's really become very critical of a lot of things in industry, including bringing up this idea that there's something fascist about superheroes and superhero culture and the messages that they convey. And while this, like I said, this is probably one of the most high-profile versions, it's an attitude that I've heard many other people bring up. And so when Riki Riki and I have been talking about this from a couple of different directions, talking about how we really want to dive into this question. And I think we're probably going to cover this a couple of ways, both in story, which is one where we're going to probably do in a couple weeks or maybe months, talking especially about Attack on Titan, but also now in more kind of the, what do these creations of art do in our larger world? So, Riki, why don't you say hello and introduce yourself and where are you kind of coming to from this question?
Yeah, hi Matthew. It's good to be here again. Riki Hayashi on board to talk about fascism. It's actually kind of what I studied in school, and I never thought it would be this relevant to study fascism. But here we are in 2024 is the year. And I brought this to you, as you mentioned, regarding Attack on Titan. I was like, hey, have you seen this? Like, it's a really, in my opinion, a problematic manga anime. And then you started asking questions about it and brought this interview with Alan Moore. And there's a lot going on in this sphere of ideas and thought. And we're not going to cover it all. So we may only briefly talk about Attack on Titan today, but kind of get into the subject and then explore where it goes, because I think it's very deep. Like Alan Moore, I'm not like a huge fan of his work, I would say, but I am a fan of his thinking. Yeah. And what he tries to do with his work. So that's a funny thing to say about him. And I do want to preface, like anything about Alan Moore, his criticism of the industry, he's gone through some stuff.
Yes.
Like he's been, I would say, screwed by the industry, by his various works being adapted and some of his friends not getting paid. So he has some bitterness. He had some jadedness about the comic book industry, and especially like adaptations of movies and stuff. But I don't think like that completely discounts what he has to say, like, because he does talk about it in a broader sense.
Well, especially because, and we're kind of just talking surface level here, we'll dive in more in just a moment. We're also going to have some feedback from our last episode at the end of this episode, talking about The Last Jedi and failure. One of the things that really struck me reading his interview and some of his other recent works, all of which we'll have notes to in the show notes, he's also very self-referential and very self-understanding of his own effect. In some ways, I think I was kind of confused when I saw that it was Moore who was saying this, because I think Watchmen is something that a lot of people point to as when superhero stories started to get more grim, dark, and also when they started to get maybe not more, but like a new generation of them becoming much more authoritarian and perhaps fascist. And he's very open about that, and he says that sort of he was disappointed that the result of Watchmen was everyone doing these sort of dark, gritty approaches to things and stuff like that. And I want to get into more of the Alan Moore of it, but let's just start by defining our terms. Riki, as someone who really studied it, can you say how would you define fascism? And in particularly, how is it different than authoritarianism? Because I think a lot of times people use those terms interchangeably, and it's important to understand that they're not the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is one of the complicated questions of our time right now, is people point to other people in the political spectrum and say, you're being a fascist. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Right.
Right.
And you're right. Like, I think fundamentally, like authoritarianism is like a bigger umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Things like it is about the government exerting control,
Right.
right? More control than perhaps should be allowed in most cases. And certainly, like we have seen in the 20th century history, the Soviet Union was
Yep.
an authoritarian state, but based upon communism,
Right.
right? And then, of course, Nazi Germany was an authoritarian state based on a more right wing ideology that we now call fascism. And I think like one of the fundamental differences of like what separates the bucket of fascism for me is the idea of a scapegoat of
Mm.
of like a out group
Right.
that gets persecuted and blamed and drives a lot of the ideology of the state to, in some extreme cases, obviously eliminate that group and to use that group as an excuse to do things like
Right.
to carry out their political agenda and get people behind it. Say like, hey, we want to do things for you, the in group, usually the majority in the nation. But to do that, like we really got to take stuff or like, punish this out group. But it's okay because
Right.
they are. And then like it develops this, dehumanization element,
Yeah.
the out group.
And I think that's really important, and especially because it's also very linked to this idea of nationalism specifically, and of like there being that one particular kind of people who the government's supposed to represent, and and that is tied to the nation. And so, for example, that's why it's very different than, for example, Soviet communism, where it's all about the work. It's not about like we are Russians, and so we're supposed to be free of Azerbaijanis or Georgians or Ukrainians. There was certainly a lot of that in communist Russia, but it was much more all about the workers and all that kind of stuff. And then the authoritarianism. Fascism becomes very much about we, the people, the right kind of people and the purity of the people. And that this other group, as you said, is dirtying us. There's a whole lot of like purity and dirtiness language. And that ties into, and this is something that Moore talks about specifically, and that's kind of wanted to frame it to help people understand this, that there's also often a lot of nostalgia tied into this of the good old days, of the back before back when like men were real men and women were real women, and we didn't have all these immigrants, or we didn't have all these foreign ideas, or we didn't have all of this kind of stuff. And I'm gonna avoid getting that political. And I think that it's kind of helpful to understand what that distinction is before we start to dive too much in this conversation, because I think there's a lot of conversation out there of are superheroes authoritarian in terms of, because a lot of authoritarianism is instead of the people getting what they want, the people get what's best for them. And a much smaller group of people or an individual gets to decide what's best for them and tell them that very much in a kind of paternalistic way. And fascism has a lot of those elements, but it's something, again, very much more specific. And since that's what Moore is saying, it's important to kind of start with there.
Yeah, and I just want to end on the difference, like the different types of authoritarianism. The Soviet-style communism was like an exportable ideology, right? Insofar as like the whole Cold War was about stopping the spread of communism. And that meant like stopping it from springing up in other nations around the world. And that's not something like you don't stop fascism from springing up. Like, I mean, we would like to, but it is something that comes more internally rather than is exported from like the Soviet Union.
Right. Like Italian fascism definitely had a strong influence on Spanish fascism and German Nazism, and Mussolini wanted that. But that, Spanish fascism is about the Spanish people and their, and German is about the German people, not about, the Italian, etc. And yeah. So with that, let's turn back to Alan Moore himself. Say a little bit more about your impressions of Moore. Before today, you read this article, but like his work, you said you don't always love it, but you respect it. Say a bit more about that.
Well, like The Watchmen is obviously one of the most influential graphic novels in our lifetime.
Yep.
And I certainly appreciate it. I'm pretty sure I still own a copy. I might have sold it, but I mean, I bought a copy. I read it multiple times. I enjoy it like as a think piece,
Right.
but for me, for my personal taste, like I don't tend to read or watch like super graphically violent things. And
Mm-hmm.
it was definitely like one of those eras when, as you said, like he was so influential that it led to this whole really change in the industry of
Right.
comics. And so like that's why like he's not one of my favorites,
Mm-hmm.
but I I enjoy that he exists and I enjoy his work, just not in the ways that like a lot of other people do.
Yeah. And I think that's really fair. And I think that there's definitely a lot of truth in that. I really love Watchmen, but I also kind of, it's one of those stories where when someone tells me they love it, I always kind of want to get a sense of like, do you think it's pro these people, or like what do you think of your perspective on it? The story of his, though, that I think is most relevant for me, at least, to these conversations, and there's going to be a bit of a digression, but I think it's very related because I think it subverts the natural tendency that a lot of these superhero stories can have towards authoritarianism and strongmanism, and specifically towards fascism, is V for Vendetta. Because spoilers for the end of a comic book that's, I think, 30 years old and a movie that's 20 years old, but one of the key things that happens at that movie is that the strongman character, the person who has been enacting great violence, I think for justifiable reasons, but in part out of wanting to help the nation, but in part very much for his own personal vendetta against the bad guys, the authoritarians in power, the fascists in power. He realizes that what he's doing is clearing away the authoritarianism, but that if he actually leads the new government, it's just going to be another kind of authoritarianism. It's going to be another strongman taking over. And so he very intentionally arranges it so that, inspired by him, the people rise up, and it is a people's uprising that takes over. And while there's not very much given about what happens next, we learn a little bit of that. It is a return to, a democracy of some kind. And because to me, I think that's often the question with superheroes or any kind of like, when it's a heroic figure helping to overturn or overthrow a corrupt government or a corrupt authority, is, well, what do you replace it with? Because if everyone now sees this one strong person as the hero, it's going to be really easy for them to want to say, okay, cool, well, you just be the new dictator, or you be the new whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, for the history of the United States, I think one of the most remarkable things that happened was that George Washington chose not to run for a third term.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's specifically a quote that basically he says, like, I don't want to be king.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to this precedent of, until FDR, like no other president attempted to run for a third term because of the George Washington precedent. And there's a lot we can say about the founding fathers and, how good or bad they were. Mm-hmm. But I think like that decision by George Washington is one of the most like fundamentally impactful that any individual has made in the history of this country.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't even thought of that in that context, but I think that George Washington played that kind of superhero role in, the media of the time and the perspective. And he, as Maple said, if he wanted to just make himself king instead of King George, it would have taken over. Yeah. We're going to start diving into the article itself right after this quick break. I'll do one thing quickly. Welcome back. Feedback is great. Membership is great. So let's talk about the article itself, because it's actually quite a long article, and it's not just about the superhero question, but I think a lot of the things in it are very connected. But Riki, do you want to start by just kind of focusing on what is his argument about superheroes and superhero culture and so the way that superhero media is affecting our culture.
Yeah, I think if I were to sum it up, it is that there's a fundamental problem with having a fantasy setting where it takes extraordinary people with superhuman abilities to solve extraordinary problems.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, that's not reality. Like, we don't have superpowers in real life. And so it creates this model, like a mythology almost, of superheroes themselves being the only ones who can solve these problems. And it's interesting. Like, there's a lot of the stuff in the article, in the interview, that I fundamentally disagreed with, in a sense, but I understand where he's coming from.
Yeah.
And I guess my main criticism, my main critique.
Well, if I can, let's just kind of lay out some more of the arguments from the article specifically, sure, and then get into the critique. So yeah, he has this point. At one point he says, the thing is, in order to actually accomplish these extraordinary things, we have to put in quite a lot of work. Perhaps years of our life, perhaps our entire lives, getting better at something. And then we can do incredible things. It's this desire to be like that without any work, to have that as an appliance almost. You find the power ring. You happen to be standing too near the rack of chemicals. And then in a stroke of fate or luck, you suddenly have incredible powers. It's that kind of longing for a quick fix. And when he was talking about that and talking about this idea of that you're waiting for someone else, I got thinking about the book that came out a number of years ago, Waiting for Superman. And it's a book that was all about trying to fix the educational system. And I'm not going to get into the book itself. I think a lot of people have been very critical of it for, I think, very good reasons, that what it's suggesting to fix the educational system wasn't the best way. But putting that aside, the title comes off, I think, a very important idea, which is that we can get to this time where we think the problems are so bleak and we think ourselves are so impowerful that we're just waiting for someone to come along and save us instead of doing the work to save ourselves. And I definitely think that that is a big part of what can lead to authoritarianism, and lead to fascism, when it's this idea of, okay, there's all this poverty, there's all this problems, we see the other is the problem. Instead of us trying to do work to do it, we're just going to wait for the party or the person or the hero to come along and fix it. And I think a lot of that existed long before superheroes were there, but I definitely see some truth to the idea of how it can encourage that kind of thinking. Talk also about his idea of nostalgia and how that plays into his argument.
Well, nostalgia is fundamental to fascism in most of its existence. It is countries having problems, like in the present, and then saying, remember when things were better? Like, let's get back to that. And usually, like I said, like, there's a persecution of an outgroup, and so you blame, like, in between, like, from the good times to now the bad times. Like, well, what happened? Like, now we have all of these outgroup people that we should persecute to get back to the good times.
Right.
I mean, in the United States, there is this nostalgia of, like, the 1950s, I guess, 1950s, just before the 60s, because the 60s is seen as, like, when America broke.
Right.
And you look at the reasons why, like, one of them was Vietnam, but another thing that people point to is the civil rights movement, right?
Yep.
And so you say, well, that has taken us away from the good 1950s, so we have to reverse all that. And that means persecution of minorities. And of course, Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision, is another one that gets nostalgized as, like, let's go, unfortunately we're going back. That was what, 1970 something?
72, I believe. 73.
So it's weird because it's so far ago, and yet like, nostalgia drives fascism, I think, in a lot of cases, because people forget There's like not enough people who were there to be like, yeah, I mean, it was okay, but a lot of stuff is better now. Like that's for
Right.
me when I think of obviously like progressivism, means
Hmm.
progress, like moving forward. But I look at our lives now and I'm like, okay, yeah, like are some things bad? Yes, but like look at the
Yeah.
things that are better than when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of this is that often it's a nostalgia not for the actual history, but this mythologized idea of history
Yeah.
where everything was better. And, you know, the 1950s were the time of, dads at work and moms at home, and the kids are hiding under their desks for air raid drills because we all think nuclear war is right around the corner.
Mhm.
And that great American dream is actually pretty terrible for anyone who's not white and who's not male and who's not, straight and cisgender and uh, and not to mention Christian and the right kind of European and all this kind of stuff. Even Catholic was pretty left out at that point. And
Or just the
go ahead.
fact that like why could the mother stay at home and be a housewife, right? Like
Right.
now both the mother and the father usually have jobs and go to work. Well, it's because the father like stopped getting a fair wage or like didn't keep up with inflation. So now you have to have a dual income family. So it's like the nostalgia for that lifestyle ignores some of the reasons why that lifestyle no longer exists. And it's like
Right.
you can't rewind to that without also rewinding the economic inequalities that have
Right.
started to take root
And
or
even
have.
then, it was still very much a white middle class
Yeah,
fantasy. There were lots of women working, just as nurses or maids or servers, often people of color, but often just poor white, because their husbands weren't making anywhere enough. It is true that that was a time when a working class person could like the ability to be the person who made enough money to buy your own house and take a vacation and do all the things that are almost completely out of reach for so many people today, yes, was true, but even that again was still for not the entire population by any means. And
absolutely. I mean, it's a nostalgia for a certain lifestyle
mhm,
that like even if you transport yourself to the 1950s, like you're probably not living that lifestyle just like
mhm,
from a percentage like standpoint.
mhm. No, I totally get that. And I think one of the most interesting parts of Moore's argument is he talks about how not only are superheroes a sign of can be a part of that nostalgia, but also that they're often that the discussion about them today is often very nostalgic itself and often just as inaccurate. He talks about how, you know, anytime someone says, why are superheroes so woke today? That is itself fundamentally an argument from nostalgia because it's a claim that they weren't woke in the past, that they used to just be all white and male and defenders of, truth, justice, and the American way. When the fact is, the first Superman, as he points out, invented by two working class teenagers from Cleveland in the middle of the Depression, who created a character that was an embodiment of a disempowered working class community. He was an immigrant like most of them, but he was not forced to dress in the drab browns and grays of most of the other people on the 1930s breadlines. He was wearing bright primary colors, and he could leap over the streets that they were having to trudge down looking for work. The early Superman beat up strikebreakers and threw a slumlord over the horizon. Obviously, that Superman didn't last a long while. He was pretty soon taken from his creators and made a much more socially respectable, middle class, and right leaning character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Superman to me is a really interesting one because of that immigrant background. And I
Right.
actually had this thought the other day of just like what if there was like an Asian Superman, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so weird that Superman stories oftentimes like ignore the immigrant aspect of his origin or just like
Right.
mention it. Like obviously they mention that he's from Krypton, but it doesn't focus on him being an immigrant.
Right.
And so like I thought like a reimagining of Superman as an Asian or maybe like now like a Muslim
Uh huh.
brown person,
Mm-hmm.
not Muslim in a religious sense, I guess, but from that region of the world. That I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like, is that something that it's too late because like Superman is white, right? Like if you try to do
Mhm.
that, like people are gonna lose their minds, even though we like Krypton is a made up planet, and like who cares what color their skin is on Krypton type of thing. But
Right.
I just like I had this thought while we were like circling around this subject. I was like, what if someone just fundamentally changes Superman?
So I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I will say I do think that they've already started some element of this conversation in that the son of Superman is now out as canonically bisexual, which is
Yeah, yeah.
interesting because it is still there's no physical change, the change to who the character is and wants to be, but he still looks the same. But you're right, it's still almost always still been white. I think one of the actors who played him on Supergirl was Latino, but still kind of like and I'll say one of the first things that occurred to me with an Asian Superman, and I'm going to try and say this delicately, but please, if any of my terms or the way I'm approaching it is problematic, please let me know. And I promise I'm going to say that and then not edit this out. So if I, really step in it, people can learn from that, I hope. But one thing that was striking me is that one of the persistent narratives around immigrants, particularly at the time of Superman, but also today, is that they're a drain on the economy. They come here and they don't work and they don't have jobs, and they don't have education, they don't know how to speak the language. And so they don't add to the tax base, they just take away from it because, we have to pay them all this welfare and all this criminal policing of them. And the fact is that that's fundamentally not true. But I think that is the general understanding of the black and brown, especially like African and Latin American immigrant experience. My understanding is, and again, you can correct me on this, that is very different than the Asian American immigrant perspective, at least today. Back in the 1800s and earlier days of the Chinese workers and this wasn't the case. But today, often the fear of the Asian immigrant is not that they're uneducated, but that they're so much better educated, that they're going to take our jobs, that their children are going to take our kids' spots at colleges. That's something I see all the time about how in New York City, there was this very racist thing that played out about how Asian immigrants were very overrepresented. That sounds pejorative. I just mean that a higher percentage of them compared to other racial groups in New York City, in terms of how many kids got into the specialized high schools that you had to pass tests for, like Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. And the reason I'm making that connection is because Superman obviously isn't the useless immigrant perspective of the person who comes here and is just a drain on the system. Again, a false narrative, but the narrative that's out there. He's incredibly useful. He's incredibly helpful. It's just a question of who gets to control that. So and again, tell me I'm way off base here, but I feel like an Asian Superman would be an interesting perspective on that because it connects more to that part of an immigrant experience where the issue isn't, oh, you're useless and you're helpless and we have to support you, but instead you're different and you're changing things in ways we don't want and you're taking things away from us. Does that all make any sense?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fair.
It was a lot to take in. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that.
Okay, let me try a much shortened version of it. Is that I think people didn't think of Superman in terms of the immigrant experience because they think of immigrants, again, from a racist perspective, as people who come here without skills, without jobs, and have become a drain on the system. And I'm wondering
okay, I think I disagree with that.
Okay.
I think the central issue regarding Superman's immigrant status is that he passes.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it.
He passes as a native white person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be the fundamental difference if you created or changed Superman to be Asian coded.
Mm-hmm.
Is that he wouldn't pass as white or maybe I don't know. It's interesting. I've started following Asian actors, and especially those who often do pass. Darren Criss is a delightful actor. You might remember him on Glee. He's been in a lot of musical type stuff. He's a great singer.
Yep.
And he's half Filipino. And recently, he won some award and talked about his Filipino mother and about his experiences. and he has definitely like started to come out stronger and identifying as Asian. And quite frankly, again, like when I watched Glee, like it didn't occur to me that he was half Asian. Like if you say that, you're like, oh, okay, I think I can kind of see it. But he's definitely on like that passing side of half. So yeah, my point is like if you have a Superman that doesn't pass, like how does that change his story? I think is where I'm going with this idea. Someone take care of it. Get in there.
I think that it makes a lot of sense, especially because remember again, the two creators were Jewish, and this is what I want to study the history of more, because I was going to say that today I think a lot of this issue of passing is one that comes up a lot in Judaism.
Sure.
And being clear, I should say within Ashkenazi Judaism, there's a perspective. There are a lot of Jews, and I think my family and my father, and to the extent that I'm Jewish myself, who benefit from white supremacy because we are white, and thus there's a perception often that Jews are white. That's very much not true. There's Jews from all over the world, and I believe more are Sephardic from kind of Spain and Africa and Southern Europe and all that. But the question of passing is also one that I think of a lot as a disabled person, because I sometimes use a prosthetic leg, and at the moment my health is not great. I've gained more weight, and so people generally can tell I walk with a limp. But on a good day, I don't walk with a limp, and it used to be I never walked with a limp. But then I'd be in a wheelchair sometimes, and that would get really confusing for people. I have a lot of unfortunate memories of parking in a disabled parking spot, getting out while I'm on my two legs, and getting really dirty looks from people who think I'm this able-bodied guy who's taking a spot. And the reality is that if I'm going into a mall or something, probably after an hour of walking, my leg's going to be in real trouble, and I'm going to need that spot that's as close as possible. But they don't see that. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think it's also really interesting in terms of how recently Marvel and DC have really split on this question of secret identities. And I'm saying that because I think secret identities is kind of part of this whole passing question, where in DC, most of the superheroes want to pass to some extent. In Marvel, not so much. And, people like Tony Stark are very open about who they are. Thor certainly is not trying to pass in any way, except for a couple of comics where he tries to be a doctor. And within the X-Men itself, this is an active debate of, I think some of the X-Men movies, X-Men 2 did a great job of saying this, where, Beast is saying to Mystique, wouldn't you want to pass? And she's saying, no, I think that we're beautiful the way we are. So yeah, I think this is kind of a whole other topic that I think I haven't been prepared for, but I think you're right. I think there's a really interesting question there of, well, how much is in terms of the marginalized experience, how much passing is, or the not passing is obviously a huge issue that I think can get very easily simplified. Like a lot of people other people say pass, like it's much more complicated than that. But yeah, I think it's very much reflected in hero culture, to be sure.
Well, let me help bring it back to the Alan Moore of it all, because it's mentioned a couple of times in this interview, like why superheroes are fascist is that their iconography gets used by people like by fascists now. And I think he mentions Donald Trump like having like laser beam eyes, like obviously Superman reference. I think literally that you can find images of him like in a Superman suit, like doing the hands on the hips pose as if he's gonna save the world, right? And it's, to me, like I don't think that this is where I say I disagree with some of Moore's ideas as far as my understanding of them. Like I don't think superheroes by definition like are fascist or lead to like fascist interpretations, but they can be taken because oftentimes these organizations are fronted by a quote unquote strong man, right? Literally, like, and the image of Superman is so ingrained in our psychology as like the strongest man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you CGI slap your face on Superman's body, like people instantly make a connection. And it's this great irony, like as we've been saying, that Superman is an immigrant and that, you know, he traditionally fights for the downtrodden.
Right.
But of course, like again, like that's part of fascist ideology, is that you are trying to appeal to people who feel that they are downtrodden and saying like, I'm gonna help you. Like I'm the
Right.
Superman that's gonna help you.
And I think one thing that's really interesting about that, and this kind of allows me to touch on my all-time favorite story that I love going back to, Marvel Civil War, is that one of the things I think that makes Superman work is that the part, if you believe the story, if you believe that he can fly and that kryptonite hurts him, you also have to believe that it's okay for him to have this incredible amount of power because he is committed to not using it, to not abusing it specifically. And to an extent, that's part of the point of Team Cap in Marvel Civil War, that no government can be trusted to have oversight over Cap because you can trust Cap to decide how to use that power, but you can't trust anyone else. And whatever you think of those two fictionalized characters, I think that the danger of that kind of thinking is that, yes, it does lead to, we can trust this government leader, we can trust Trump. And just to show that I'm somewhat even-handed about this, I do think that there was some element of that with Obama, of like, he can do no wrong and everything he does is right, and he was certainly described as our Superman. And there was a lot of that, like Obama as Superman language that I think then about, some of us who during his presidency were like, guys, he's killing lots of people with drones. He's doing a lot of these kind of moderate things that are not cool. Ran up into of this idea of, no, but he's Obama, we can trust him. And
Yeah.
It's sort of
if you're familiar with the Dark Brandon memes,
mm-hmm.
like that is feeding off of that same imagery and iconography.
Yeah, very much so.
Ideology of like the laser beam eyes, and like when he puts on the aviators, like it gives him superpowers type of thing. Like that's almost like his costume, like his superhero costume now.
One of my favorite Superman comics, and I admit I've not read many of them, but this one I have read, and I'd say favorite Superman stories, because certainly experienced his stories in many other mediums, is Kingdom Come by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. Have you read that?
Yeah, it's been a few years, but I remember it.
Yeah, because I think the fundamental idea of this is that when Lois Lane and other people are killed, hold on a second, let me just quickly check this. Yeah, so a big part of that story is this idea that Superman does start to cross the lines, that he does start to say, the way things are being run is not okay. I need to step in and stop this, even though I don't have the actual authority, because I have the power to do so. And that people have to trust me that I know what I'm doing is right in order to make this work. And I think I'm mixing it, and there's another story that is similar where he does something similar. I think I'm mixing the two of them up. But either way,
Injustice, probably.
Yeah, which is the one where he keeps Metropolis locked up in a little glass jar.
That sounds like Kingdom Come.
Okay. Yeah, but
Injustice, like he literally just becomes a tyrant and takes over the entire world.
Yeah. Injustice is that one. Red Sun is another one that's like, because Red Sun is about the idea of what if his capsule had arrived a couple hours later and crashed in the Ukraine instead of in Kansas. But in all of them, I think the idea is supposed to be that this is a horrific idea that is meant to be a tale to say that the reason why it's safe to have Superman is that we know he would never actually do this.
Right. And having these Superman stories where he does do it, where he becomes a dictator, where he kills people, etc., I think that's problematic from a industry standpoint, I guess, from a storytelling standpoint. Like we talked in the past, I love Sinestro. He's literally a fascist, designed to look like Hitler with his little mustache. And when Alan Moore mentions, the power ring, he's talking about the Green Lantern mythos. And I felt like he was specifically talking about Sinestro, right? Like
Right.
Sinestro uses his power ring to take over his planet and impose his style of order, which often, involves imprisoning people who speak out, etc. Like, so it's just classic dictatorship. But he is the villain. Like, he is always clearly the villain.
Yeah.
There's a couple of stories where he takes on an anti-hero role, and I do find that interesting. But he's never the good guy. And that's why I think, like, having him is fine, because we understand who he is and what he is. Having Superman, like, occupy that same space of being a tyrant is problematic, because we have so much history of Superman as the good guy. And then we see him do some tyrant stuff, and it's like, but he's Superman, so it's mostly fine. Like, maybe he crosses the line this one time, but it's mostly okay. Like, I'm okay with this.
Yeah.
I think that's the problem that
I can see that
Alan Moore is getting at.
Yeah. I think it makes a lot of sense. And one thing that I'm also struck by is that for a lot of comic book characters, not all, and maybe this is something that's fading, and listeners definitely let me know what you think. Because what I was thinking is that Clark isn't just someone who comes to Earth and randomly gets powers and he's never thought about this before. Part of the idea is that whole time that he's in the capsule, both when he's in the capsule and then when he's with Martha and Mom and Pa Kent,
Why'd you say that name?
Yeah.
I just had to get that in.
Both his Kryptonian parents and his Earth parents are teaching him from a very early age, yes, you have the power, but you have to have these lines that you will not cross. You have to be able to, because there is no police that can stop you. There is no one else, and you could just become an authoritarian. So we have to teach you to be that person. And in Captain America, it's flipped a bit. It's not that the people giving him the power teach him that. It's that they only give him the power because they can tell he already knows that. And Spider-Man has, Uncle Ben saying with great power comes great responsibility. And one thing I think is that a lot of newer stories, you don't have that. No one's saying to Jessica Jones, her friends are kind of tearing her hair out, but she just gets powers. Luke Cage just gets powers. And I think I like those stories more because we see them wrestling with it and it feels more realistic to me. But it has more of the danger of, that it's funny because I'm often go ahead.
You have to have Clark Kent, because what you're describing, like, the Kents raise Superman as Clark Kent and teach him these values, and oftentimes, like, people describe it as different characters, like Clark Kent and Superman being different characters, or like different sides of the coin, like who's the real one, like who's the disguise, etc. But in my opinion, a good Superman story needs to have significant Clark Kent. And that's where, like, stuff like you're talking about, like Injustice, I think has like zero Clark Kent. Like, they call him Clark because, like, once you're a dictator, who cares? Like, you don't have a secret identity anymore. But he no longer dresses as Clark. Like, obviously he doesn't work as at the Daily Planet as a reporter while he's also the dictator.
Well, one of the things that happens in that story is that forgive me, spoilers here if you want to skip ahead.
Well, it's like the first 5 pages.
Yeah, Lois Lane dies.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that's one of his last connections.
Yeah, that's
Clark.
What drives him.
Yeah, very much so.
But that, like, I think, what gets forgotten is the Clark Kent character in a lot of these Superman stories, and I think, like, Zack Snyder Superman Man of Steel is very similar in that there's not enough Clark Kent to really balance the story out. And that was one of the things about the Christopher Reeve Superman. Like, some of the most delightful scenes are the Clark Kent scenes.
Right.
Or the scenes where it's like there's both of him. Right. I think there's a scene that gets clipped a lot where he is Clark Kent talking to Lois Lane and he's debating whether to tell her his secret identity. And she turns away and you watch him, like, literally transform, like, his Justice posture. And I think he, like, takes off his glasses and changes his posture, and he's thinking about telling her, and then he changes his mind and, like, changes back, like, his posture changes back.
Yeah.
And it's not only a great acting performance, by Christopher Reeve, but also just like a fundamental and interesting exploration of this character, the duality of it. And you have to have that. And I think like again, like that's where Alan Moore is going, is like superhero stories shouldn't just be about superpowers. It should be about the human beings or whatever Kryptonians behind the powers and exploring their stories.
Yeah.
And people often say stuff like Superman is a boring character because he's invulnerable and he can do all these things. That's why you got to have the Clark Kent.
Yeah. And I think it's like, I used to very much be one of those people, and Jessica Plummer, who's a frequent guest on here and who is a huge Superman fan, has a very similar perspective to what you're saying. She often talks about how her favorite Superman on screen is the New Adventures of Lois and Clark.
Yes,
which the name alone tells you this. And its heart and soul, I think very much also, she said, like the first of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, it's a rom-com.
Oh yeah,
like it with meet cutes and all this kind of stuff, and they're like, which one are you going to fall in love with?
I mean, F. Dean Cain, like, and everything he's done since then. But yes, like
the show's still great.
That show had a lot of Clark Kent, and because Clark Kent is vulnerable, right? Like, he's not physically vulnerable because underneath he's Superman, but he can't get Lois to go out with him.
Yeah,
as Clark Kent. And like in the movies as well, like Lois is in love with Superman and ignores Clark Kent. And yeah, like I love that. I love those stories.
Yeah. And there have been so many homages to that, like I everything from the Toby Parker Toby Parker.
I don't know where you're going.
The Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, where you have the the Mary Jane character who kind of has much more a crush on Spider-Man than Toby. I think Princess Leia is in many ways a Lois Lane figure of she's the damsel, but she's not the damsel, and she's going to have all sorts of back talk for the people who rescue her and stuff like that. Let's pull back, though, to our main topic, and there's a lot more we can say about this. I think I'll just say that I'm a little different than you in the kind of stories I like, in that I think for me, because I fundamentally do not believe the conceit that it's okay for someone like Superman or Captain America to have all the power they do, and that we can just trust them, because I don't believe that, and I think it's dangerous. And I think that's why I really like stories like Kingdom Come, or even more the stories where the character wrestles with how are they going to use the power and then decides to do the right thing, because those are stories in our own world, like underdog stories are great, but, and this isn't all my audience, but it's a lot of us, if you're an American citizen, a lot of times our story isn't the plucky little underdog. Our story is the Superman of the world who has to decide, when is it right for us to use our power to do what we think is right in the world, or should we be holding back because us coming in as Superman in the world doesn't actually help. So I guess, to me, going back to this original question, I want to read more of Alan Moore's thinking. I'm not quite convinced that superheroes are fascist, but I think he's got a point in that the modern sort of rebirth of fascism, I don't think is caused by superhero culture, but I think has some overlaps there. And I think certainly there's a lot of elements of superheroes that overlap with authoritarianism that we're definitely going to keep talking about, because I think there is something about all these stories about one strong person will come and save the day.
Yeah, and I think part of his criticism is on media literacy or audience literacy and like understanding the stories, because if we go back to the Watchmen, like his Ozymandias is a villain, right? Like we should read him as a villain. Like he is a hero in that world, but then does villainous things. And so like this is where we point to, is like he's creating this archetype of the evil Superman.
Right.
But I think like in reading the Watchmen, like the graphic novel, like it's pretty clear. But then you get to something like the movie, and Zack Snyder like frames it in much more of a question mark. Like, is Ozymandias a villain? Like, I don't know, you decide. It's like, no, like don't let people decide, because you might be disappointed by what they decide. I don't think Alan Moore is like you decide. He's like, he's a villain. I'm writing him as a villain, but he quote unquote wins anyway. And
Yeah.
should we tell stories like that? I don't know.
I think it's somewhat different, and that there's a good reason for us to rewatch the movie. But also, have you seen the TV show that was made of The Watchmen?
I have not.
It is very good, and I think goes a lot deeper into this question. And I think it's asking actually. I think you're right that those people who are saying no, Ozymandias is kind of an anti-hero are completely wrong. It's not an open question. He is a villain. But I think what Alan Moore is saying, the world was saved by a villain. That if he had not done what he did, there was almost definitely going to be a nuclear war.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the other question, is what does it say about our world when the fact was we needed a villain? And so does that mean that he's not a villain, or does it mean that we need to fix things so that we don't need the villain again?
Right, that the world itself was already broken to a degree beyond repair. Like, hopefully, like it does get repaired, but
right.
It was broken to a point where a hero could not save the world.
Right. I have a tangent that I want to ask, so we're going to save that for our I have a tangent I want to ask, so we're going to save that for our bonus content for our members.
The other thing I guess I want to end on is, like, at one point he mentions, again, like the audience and about how comic book heroes were originally written for kids. Mm-hmm. And then, like, as kids grew up, the stories continued, and the industry, like these companies, wanted to keep making money off of these characters. And that's why, like, nostalgia comes into play, right? Like, if you liked Superman as a kid, well, like, we still got Superman as an adult for you, but because it's for an adult audience, like, it's a little more mature, it's a little darker, like, he makes some questionable decisions, right? Like, because that's what we think mature storytelling is. And I fundamentally disagree, because you and I watch a lot of cartoons. Like, Star Wars cartoons are for kids. Like, Rebels is for kids. I don't think there's any question about that. But we enjoy it as adults, and we find interesting things to discuss in it. And it doesn't have to be like this gritty, dark thing.
So you walked right into my trap. I mean, sorry. You actually led to the point I was going to make in disagreement.
There you go.
Which is also in disagreement with Moore, because I think he actually seems to believe that it's only adults who are reading comics. I don't think that's true. I think adults are continuing to read the comics they grew up on, and so some of them have matured. But also, there's a whole bunch of new comics. There are versions of these things for kids, but also there's Kamala Khan. There's, oh God, I can't remember his name. There's Miles Morales. There's all sorts of, and thousands of new characters that I don't even know about that kids love and that all ages can love. Yeah. But to go to your example, in Star Wars, yes, we have those kids shows. We also have Andor. And if there's anything that says we're going to take the more simple, young adult, all ages story of Star Wars of good and evil and complicate it a lot and make it a lot more gritty and dark, that's Andor. Yeah. So to me, I guess I kind of see that. I think that can be the medium. Is we don't. If Star Wars was all Mandor, it'd be Andor. It'd be terrible. I said Mandor because also Mandor, I think, isn't that same. Like, when a person's body gets chopped in half 10 minutes into the first episode of Mando and you hear the thud of the body hitting the ground, I was like, oh, we're not for kids anymore. But yeah, so I hear your point. I just think that I think we do have some of that in the comics universe right now. It's just that probably, like, we're not... I was going to say, but they're not getting made into movies, but, like, Ms. Marvel is a movie, Yeah.
Well, it was a TV show, and then The Marvels was a movie.
That's true, yeah. And Into the Spider-Verse, the Miles Morales stuff. Well, there's a lot more on this topic we can discuss. Listeners, as always, let us know what you think. Go to the website, theethicalpanda.com. Find us under The Ethical Panda. We did get some interesting feedback about the topic we discussed last week that I wanted just to end on. And as always, keep giving us this feedback. Let us know what you think. Chris McCurdle, who I know is a big fan of these stories and someone who thinks a lot about these kind of issues, wrote in response to my question about, is failure a good teacher? Failure is a good teacher so long as you try and learn from it. If you fail and quit, as Luke did until Rey and Yoda came calling, it can't teach.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you very much for the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
I think in our discussion, I talked about like depression, like cycles of depression when you fail.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like that's why fundamentally, like I guess I would disagree with the failure is a good teacher, is
Mm-hmm.
because if you fail, like if you continue to fail, you can fall into the cycle where you give up, and in a sense, like giving up is the ultimate failure, right? Because
Yep.
if you don't come back, like you're not doing the thing, so you're not succeeding. And so if we're talking about like teachers or like how to mentor someone to do something, that's why like I don't think failure is all that great. I think you can create an environment where you don't fail but still learn lessons, or just kind of maybe like stumble,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a safety net, and the stumble doesn't cost you or your organization too much.
Yeah.
Going back to like you and I used to do Magic the Gathering judging, and that this is one of the things I would try to set up is environments where there was like a safety net that gave people an opportunity to try something new, but to be okay with not succeeding.
Yeah. That
But
could be a
not
mock
failing.
tournament, or it could be something where you have a mentor right over your shoulder who can catch you if you're about to cause a
Yeah.
problem.
But not failing, because a failure would mean, like a tournament, an event goes badly, and then the
Mm-hmm.
customers, the players have a bad experience, and that person, the judge running that, is going to have a bad experience too, and be like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. Like that's what you got to avoid, and that's
Yeah.
why like I love Yoda, but this is not the airport book for me. Like failure is the best teacher. No, like to give people an opportunity. I think stumble. And maybe
Yeah.
like that's where like nuance of these phrases is important.
Right. Which, by the way, is Riki introduced me to another fantastic podcast called "If Books Could Kill," which is a lot about like diving into the problems with these airport self-help books, which is wonderful.
And I love those books. I love
Yeah.
reading those books, but you can't take them at face value.
Yeah.
Just like Yoda.
I think I'm a little more defensive of, that's the wrong term. I think I'm a little more still on Yoda's side with this, but I think I would change it to failure can be a great teacher.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the thing, is like, because I think on the one hand, it is good to set up situations where people can try things and possibly fail, like put really big mats under the jungle gym so that kids can try it. And if they slip, they're going to be okay. But I mean, this was not working for you, which I'm happy about, because I don't know if it would have kept working for you, but I certainly made a screw up that caused a huge problem at a conference I was working at, a tournament I was working at. I didn't try to do it. It wasn't a good thing that I did it. And it did take some very strong mentorship to help me realize, like, that it doesn't mean I'm terrible and I should never do this again, but I'm absolutely never going to do that again. I mean, I definitely learned from it. And so I think, yeah, to me, failure is an opportunity, is maybe the way I would say it. Like, failure gives you the chance to learn from it, but you have to you have to have a support system, both internally and maybe externally, that helps you stay away from the depression, stay away from the therefore I should quit. And you also have to be self-reflective enough to be able to recognize, is this a time where you failed because you made a mistake, or is this a time where you did everything right and still failed? So there's,
yeah, and you have to have like a certain amount of fortitude to get over failure, and that I think that's where I have problems with it. Is like you often hear phrases like, "Oh, well, just toughen up," right?
right.
And people have different toughnesses, whether it's emotional, mental, like physical toughness. Again, like going back to my experience as a runner, like when you run a marathon, it's really rough. And not everyone's going to finish, and you can't just be like, well, like you got to train more, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, life to me, if I never fail in life again, like that would be great. I would prefer that.
That's fair. That's fair. All right, listeners, what do you think? As always, we want to hear from you. We want you to become a member. It's a great way to be part of the process. Help us along. Riki, thank you so much. We're going to have a quick conversation going a little bit deeper on the Watchmen for our bonus content for members. For everybody else, thank you so much for listening. We have spoken. All right, so I wanted to go a little deeper on that question. So welcome back, members. Thank you as always. You're what really makes this podcast possible. And Riki, I want to go a little bit deeper on this question of the Ozymandias character in The Watchmen. Particularly, actually, where we wanted to start, though, was one of context, because I often think of Watchmen and V for Vendetta in very similar terms, because they're both by Alan Moore. They both have some similar themes. V for Vendetta was written about Thatcher. And when they made the movie, and I believe this was somewhat at Alan Moore's direction, but I know that he also has some objections, so I'm not sure exactly. But they updated the story to be much more, so that the threats were based on things that were much more relevant, when a lot of people watching, at the point, probably had no memory of Thatcher, or didn't know enough about it. Thatcher didn't have the visceral fear that it caused.
And we're talking about Margaret Thatcher, the former prime minister.
Right, and the kind of Ronald Reagan of the United Kingdom in many ways.
Yeah.
Watchmen comes out during the Cold War, and particularly during the Reagan years of the Cold War, where a lot of people believe that Reagan is intentionally ratcheting up the pressure and that the USSR is ratcheting up the pressure, and the fear of nuclear war is almost at the levels it was in like the early 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that kind of time. And the heart of the story is this question of, if we think that the chance that nuclear war is going to happen as an almost certainty, I feel the kind of question is there a level of villainy that you'd almost never accept, but you will accept because of that it helps end the fear of nuclear war? I remember that because I grew up. I was pretty young when the Cold War ended, but I hid under a desk a couple times. We did air raid drills in my school. And I feel like part of why people who watched the Watchmen movie or read it now don't really get that point about Ozymandias and this whole idea of like, he's wrong, but the terror is so great that maybe it's okay, but probably not, is because they kept it during this, the whole concept is that the Cold War will only end in nuclear war, so we have to stop it. All of us alive today know that's not true.
Is there a question?
I guess I'm postulating that theory, and I'm wondering what you think.
That people
misinterpret Watchmen because they don't Watchmen is about how far are you willing to go to prevent something that we know today didn't have to be prevented because it just didn't happen. And I'm wondering, is that part of why people are gentler or that they don't quite understand what Moore was trying to do?
I'm not sure. Like, the story itself makes it clear. Like, they continually bring up the doomsday clock, right?
Right.
And then it's now like minutes away from midnight. I personally don't remember the doomsday clock growing up. Like, I know it, even now I think it still exists as a thing that the group curates and updates. But I was never cognizant of it as a threat. Growing up, I don't remember any air raid drills. I grew up in California, so we had earthquake drills. Fundamentally is like, I guess, similar. But I don't recall that for me an existential threat. I mean, it was mentioned. Like, I understood the principle of mutually assured destruction and nuclear weapons and all that. But I guess like I had a more of a fundamental optimism that why would we do this? Like the human race, like why would we destroy ourselves?
Right.
And for me, like fictionalizations of it is like, yeah, like it happens in fiction, but so do a lot of other things. I guess I just had a more optimistic upbringing about stuff like that. So it Watchmen to me, why do people misunderstand it? I think was your question.
Yeah, and
And
is that kind of lack of understanding of the context of it a part of why it's misunderstood?
no, and I think Moore is saying this, like the when he comments on the superhero fascism, is that people. I'm trying to like find the quote. He talks about like how people want a quick fix.
Mm-hmm.
That superheroes are the shortcut of like I have this power so I can do this thing, and that's what's appealing about it, and that's why it fundamentally doesn't work in reality, obviously, because there are no quick fixes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure. Like, I think people just like the superhero strongman. Like Ozymandias is appealing as a character,
Right.
right? In that, I think he's an interesting character. He's presented like he looks good. He looks like the classic archetype
Mm-hmm.
Superman hero. Um, and I think like that's what Moore is trying to do here. But then, yeah, like people ignore the subtext or don't think too deeply about it. They're just like, oh yeah, this guy is
Yeah.
the Superman of the Watchmen. And when you create that shortcut, again, that's why I was like, I don't know that we should necessarily have these stories where literal Superman is the villain,
Mm.
because like our brains are wired in a certain way to understand these people, these characters.
Right. I can see that, and I guess maybe another way to interpret Watchmen is it's not that it's the idea of the question of if we think nuclear war is a certainty, what level of villainy can we live with to stop it? But instead of is the issue that we could stop nuclear war through hard work and all of us coming together, and that Ozymandias that's the lazy way out. That's the Superman come save us, Ozymandias come save us. Yes, millions of people died, but billions of people didn't. So yeah,
I mean, that
I can see that too.
interesting thing is like there's a literal Superman story, the movie Superman 4.
Right, the quest for peace.
Yeah, and in that movie, Superman forcibly disarms nations of their nuclear weapons.
Right.
I just thought of that, and that's I don't know where to go with this. Like maybe like we have to save that for the future, but how I would have to like look at the history of when that movie came out versus Watchmen and like other kind
Right.
of nuclear winter. Because what was the other? There was a movie. War Games was about
Yep.
like a mutually assured destruction scenario with computers and AI.
Yep.
That
Which we did an episode. It's been a while ago, but we did do an episode on that with a couple of AI experts. That was a really fun one to talk about because I love that movie. That's one of my absolute favorite of the teenager saves the world kind of movies.
And like the Terminator franchise has Judgment Day is a nuclear war. So like maybe like it's a similar thing where audiences became desensitized to the idea of nuclear war because like they'd seen it so much in fiction,
Right.
and it takes on an aura of unreality in that way. Like, and maybe that's what I dealt with is like I saw it in these movies, like, but that's never going to happen in real life.
Yeah, and the maybe our upbringing being very different because I think the combination of being very kind of hyped into American politics, the Reagan and all that. My parents having had a lot of kind of like that 1950s under the air raid desk trauma that I think kind of they passed on. I had a lot of nightmares about nuclear war when I was a kid, and they stopped when the Soviet Union fell. And again, I was 12. I don't think I had a full understanding of the complexities, and certainly nuclear war is still a concern that I think it's like it gets overblown to some extent with the whole Israel-Iran thing, but still is a very real concern that people have. But I for me, there was a real kind of like catching my breath after 11 years of holding it when the Soviet Union fell. Not again because it was rah-rah U.S., but just because that thought nuclear war changed. So, well, go ahead.
I think the concept of like the fear of the nuke has shifted because like your fear, like growing up, was of literally like the missiles crossing each other in space, right? Like hundreds of missiles and then everything gets blown up.
Yep.
Whereas nowadays, like what I have seen like in media and I guess like in real news is a fear of the rogue state or the rogue-ish state, like North Korea, Iran, or, like some group of terrorists getting a hold of a nuclear weapon and setting it off somewhere. Like that's something that gets used more than the missiles crossing in space.
And it may well be just the difference of at 11 years old, I was able to see through the scare and the propaganda. Whereas today, when people tell me to be afraid of trans people or of immigrants or of brown people or, I'm much more like, nah, that's dumb. But yeah. Listeners, let us know what you think. This has been a really fun conversation. I think we have this to me is going to be one of those podcasts that we reference back to a lot because I think there's going to be at least 3 more podcasts that come out of this idea.
So, we didn't even get to Attack on Titan.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I expected, to be clear.
So, Riki, as always, thank you so much. Listeners, members, thank you so much. We have spoken. And we're out.